So welcome all to this month's webinar, which is how will the election result impact the industry? So thank you all for joining. I think we've still got quite a few coming through at the moment. Just a bit of housekeeping as usual. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with everyone who registered. It will also be accessible on our website, bcis.co.uk. If you want to stay up to date with the latest news and insights from BCIS, please follow our LinkedIn page if you don't already. And we will welcome questions from attendees throughout the session, so please feel free to contribute. We've already had a number of questions submitted over to us from previous webinars that we get from our audience currently. So this will be the bulk of today's webinar, which we've kind of prepared the questions for. We will also try and answer as many as we can during the webinar if we get time at the end, and we'll play it by ear. So as usual, some poll questions will pop up on the screen during the webinar. So you can also be accessed anytime if you click on the little graph button, which I'll just show you here. You should see on your toolbar at the bottom there. If you can pop us the questions in, if we can't cover them today, we will get back to you and cover them. But they're really, really helpful for us from a content perspective, and it will help us with future insight. So given that one of the principles of the new government is to improve how major projects are carried out, most of the poll questions today are on the theme of managing and benchmarking project data. So to allow the questions to be answered right up to the end of the webinar, we won't publish the answers during the webinar, but we will share it with all of you at the end of this recording session, and we'll circulate to all attendees. So if you've got any questions isn't relevant for you, obviously feel free to ignore them. And also, we do ask if you could complete them as much as possible. So please take your time to complete the survey if you can. It helps us plan future webinars and content and understand how we can help you going forward as well. So there's also the option to ask any questions that you didn't ask during the webinar. If you think of them later, please just let us know, and we'll always helpfully get back to you as soon as we can. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two guest experts today. So first of all, we've got Dr. David Crosswaite, who is the Chief Economist at BCIS. So good morning, David.
Good morning, all.
And we've got Carl Horton, who is our Chief Data Officer for BCIS. So good morning, Carl.
Morning, Rich. Morning, everyone.
Great. Just a quick run through of the agenda, what we're doing today. We'll do the quick introduction from myself. Then we're going to cover what impact do elections have on the construction industry. Then we're going to cover the submitted questions. So we'll go through these in a lot more detail, but the headlines here are: can the government build 1.5 million homes in 5 years? What's the best way to grow the construction workforce? Should the new government take a different approach to managing major projects? Which will impact construction more, the new government or the Bank of England? Is the new government pro net zero? And then we'll go on to any other questions that we've got. So the webinar is, of course, a reflection on Labour's victory at the ballot box on the 4th of July and what it will mean for the construction industry. One of the party's central pledges is that it will get Britain building again. So this week, Rachel Reeves, I'm sure everyone has seen, but upon discovering a project overspend of 22 billion, announced the new hospitals programme will be subject to a complete review. So whatever they put forward instead, they say will be thorough, realistic, and cost saving for a timetable for delivery. There is also to be a review of transport commitments, including the cancellation of the Stonehenge Tunnel and the £85 million Restore Our Rail programme. But their key pledge is to include 1.5 million new homes with a boost for affordable housing, a national wealth fund with a target of attracting £3 of private investment for every £1 of public investment, establishment of Skills England, and a green prosperity plan. So in considering whether or not the election will have an impact on the industry, we should first see just what state the industry is in. So I'm going to start by handing over to David, who's going to give us a quick snapshot of what we are in terms of output. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Rich. A very, very quick context setting, really. Hopefully, most of you on the call will recognise this slide. This was from the last Outlook webinar where we look at construction outlook, output, and we produce forecasts. And it's sort of pertinent to say, I think, that our forecasts weren't influenced by the outcome of the election, because we actually produced them prior to the election. But we looked at the manifestos of each party, and they were broadly similar. So the current state of play is that construction output is falling. If you look at the graph, the top grey line is total output. Then the blue line is new work, and the green line is repair and maintenance output. So if you look closely, you can see that declines are evident in both new work and repair and maintenance output over the last year. In new work, there were annual declines in all sectors, with private housing, infrastructure, and private industrial all showing at least a 10% fall in output over the year. The largest increase in annual output was in private housing, repair and maintenance, so not all bad news. And our forecast from last time was that we expect construction output to plateau this year, and then to start recovering from 2025 onwards. But the caveat to all of that is obviously what is coming to fruition now with the Labour Party having quite a large majority. So we've unpicked a lot of their manifesto pledges, and also the sort of speeches over the last couple of weeks, some of which have implications for construction going forward. Brilliant.
Thanks, David. So useful to have a look at the elections in general and what impact they might have on construction. So I'm going to hand over to Carl to pick up that next section there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rich. So I guess nice, easy question to sort of kick things off about trying to understand the impact of elections over the course of construction over the years. I guess in considering this question, we've looked at some of the key kind of areas around construction output and construction inflation. So what we've sort of said is in the first instance, let's have a quick look at all new construction output. And what we've done is we've plotted the sort of construction output for all new work from the late 1990s, so 1997. So I guess the kind of key observations, what we saw across the period, and what we've kind of denoted on the axis at the bottom is which kind of party was the governing party over that period. And what we've tried to sort of show is where the kind of general trend is. And from just looking at the construction output, the kind of, I guess, the initial things to take away are the construction output peaked around 2018 under Conservative governance, before sort of declining sharply. Really noticeable around the 2020 and 2021 period. Obviously, we all know that was kind of the COVID era. Despite the fluctuations, the overall trend under Labour shows more consistent growth compared to the coalition and Conservative periods. So I think the data suggests that political governance has a noticeable impact on the construction sector's performance, as opposed to, let's say, the election itself. The data also suggests that for all new construction, that Labour periods display more robust and consistent growth in total new work compared to the sort of coalition and Conservative periods. So if we move and go into the next slide for me, if that's okay, Rich. If we now kind of consider.
Sorry, I was just going to say, unfortunately, the graph was missing on the last one, but we'll make sure that's in the pack when we circulate.
No worries. Everyone's just wondering what the hell I was talking about then, that last one then. Great. There's a load of lines. Put this way, everyone, there's a load of lines on it, and it was pointing in one way for Labour. So if we consider now, I guess, infrastructure specifically, which tend to be the kind of area, because it's public sector money, tends to be more area where there is, I guess, a greater influence. The data seems to support the notion that Conservatives are the party that build infrastructure. So under the last Labour government and the coalition government, infrastructure growth actually declined. So whilst what you can see from the last sort of the Aussie extended period with the Conservative government, there was a big shift in output growth. I guess the key observations are that infrastructure output remained relatively flat over the whole of the kind of period, I guess, from a Labour perspective and the Labour in the sort of declining sense as well. There has been a significant increase in output over this period, and I guess the highest peaks in growth all aligns to Conservative sort of periods as opposed to the sort of Labour government. If we move on to the final one, what I wanted to just cover off was what does that mean in terms of kind of inflation and construction inflation in particular. So what we sort of plotted here is our general building cost index and our all-in tender price index. I guess there's nothing particularly surprising in terms of the cost and price inflation over the period. You can see that there are the sort of traditional peaks and troughs, which tend to be aligned to more kind of financial implications. The data indicates that construction inflation is influenced in some degree by political governance and external economic factors. But what I'd say the main conclusion of the output and inflation slides suggests that there's nothing dramatic that happens in the period just after an election, which I think is quite I guess a salient point to sort of take and gives us a bit of a comfort in the fact that as an industry, we seem to be able to absorb the initial impact of an election. It's more what happens in the 1 to 2 years after that when the sort of policies have all been made and you start to see that kind of filter effect. Dave, I'm not sure if there's any other sort of views you had on that.
No, I think the major interest in that slide is the dramatic fall in the TPI after the financial crisis. That's obviously had a much bigger impact than a lot of people thought. When you think that towards the right-hand side of the chart, the end of the series, we've got COVID and the war in Ukraine and Brexit. That the actual decline after the financial crisis seems to have had more of an impact. So.
Yeah,
and I think that's shown in the output slides as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the immediate election of gives us an indication, I guess. But it's when the actual policies come into fruition and we start to see, 1 or 2 years after that, after the election, is when we start to see it come through, isn't it? That's when the output starts to sort of kick on or not, so to speak, in some respects, depending on what our Chancellor says.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting also that the Conservatives appear to be the party that build infrastructure, and some of this will be because a lot of major projects were completed during their tenure, and it's difficult for us to ascertain whether or not they were started during a Labour government and then taken through the build phase when the Tories were in power. But there is a marked difference there between the parties. Unfortunately, we could only go back to 1997, but it would be interesting to see if we could get data to go back a little bit further. But yeah, that's quite stark in terms of a major difference between the parties.
Yeah. Back to you then, Rich.
Great.
I think it's over to me, isn't it?
I was just going to give it back to our host. He's in the chair.
I'll decide. Yes, right. Right. Okay. Lovely. So we're going to be turning to the first of our submitted questions, which is, can the government build 1.5 million homes in 5 years? So before I hand over, can we try and avoid any politician type answers and actually get a view? It would be good. We've heard mixed reviews in the market. So I'm going to pass over to David, I think, next.
Yeah. I mean, this is a question that's attracted a lot of press interest, frankly, ever since the election. But obviously, over the last week or so, there's been various clarifications about what they're proposing, and this is nothing new. We went back, saw a BBC website article from 2015. Just before the Tories won their election. It was, I think, at the time of this article, the coalition was still in power. And the question was, why can't the UK build 240,000 houses a year? Well, if you look at what Angela Rayner announced on Tuesday, they're looking to build 370,000. So that's a big step up. If we move on to the next slide, we can actually see UK house building completions data from the ONS, and this goes. We've actually gone back in this series to the peak of house building in 1970. And you can clearly see the decline in home completions since the peak then. And I think the starkest bit of data in this chart is the sort of turquoise line, the third line down, which is local authority provision. And that's declined from just under 200,000 in 1970. I think it was about 185,000 homes built completed in 1970 to just 4,000 last year. And housing association provision was supposed to take some of that up. I mean, this is a result of Thatcherite policies from the late 70s, early 80s. But obviously, the housing provision is the green line at the bottom, and that's remained. There's some growth there, but it's remained relatively flat and fairly insignificant over the period. Commercial property developer completions, which is the orangey line, they're by far the largest provider, and they're averaging about 157,000 completions per annum over the last 6 decades. So Tuesday's announcement by the Housing Secretary is all well and good, but what she failed to mention, and what really sort of got me interested in this, was who was going to build these homes. 370,000 new homes a year. I mean, that's more than 1,000 a day. And if you look at the chart, you can actually see that completions are actually still below the level prior to the financial crisis in 2008. So if we move on to the next slide, Rich. So addressing that question, can the government build that many homes? In 1970, almost 380,000 homes were completed in the UK, so it is possible, but in my opinion, I think it's highly unlikely given the current housing delivery model. Completions, as we saw on that chart, previous chart, have been on a downward trend since 1970, and they've settled at a long-term average of 217,000 per year over the last few decades. Currently, 80% of those new homes are built by commercial property developers, and they control the supply to maximise their returns. So it's difficult to see how Labour will be able to influence commercial property developers to achieve their ambitious targets. And as that piece in the BBC, on the BBC website hinted to, over the last few decades, many governments have tried to influence the number of new homes being built, but most, if not all, have failed, largely because the supply is in the hands of the commercial property developers, and governments have no lever to control housing supply. So essentially flooding the market with new homes, which the Labour Party seem to want to do, is not going to be in the best interest of property developers, or existing homeowners for that matter, as carefully controlled supply maintains price levels. And for me, the only way that the government could really influence supply would be to build themselves, which they obviously used to do when local authorities employed direct labour to build social housing. But this option seems unlikely, given the current state of the public finances, which Rachel Reeves highlighted just a couple of days ago. We'll go on to the next slide, Rich.
Actually, David, just while we're on this, so
yeah.
Assuming not all of the local authorities fail to meet targets, what sort of penalties could the government impose, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. Carl, you might.
I'll open it to the floor if you like, but
yeah, maybe.
I think there's obviously there's a way of, I guess, incentivizing it, and I'll use that in inverted commas, really, in terms of, you know, the government could say to local authorities around potential for removing funding if they aren't actually sort of maintaining the quota, or those that are perhaps ahead of the quota or are on track are incentivized, you know, from a increased funding to other sort of departments. So I think there's ways that they can try to support in that sense. Obviously, one of the biggest blockers is around planning and sort of planning permissions. So again, it's a little bit like working with, and I know there's going to be a sort of planning infrastructure bill that goes out. It's about making sure that there is a lot of the bureaucracy, a lot of the red tape that is involved in building houses is looked at and considered. I'm not saying we should be looking to build outside of the green belt wherever possible, but it's about making sure that when we're approaching big development sites, that it's giving, I guess, a fair crack of the whip.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I think the other issue is stability, and you know, over the last decade or so, that's one thing that we haven't really had. You know, we've had 5 different prime ministers over the last decade. We've had COVID, Brexit, and the war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East. It seems to me that what Labour have been saying over the last couple of weeks is that they are a serious party and that they want, irrespective of what they're proposing in terms of trying to grow things, what they really want is stability. And it was interesting to see how the markets reacted after Rachel Reeves' speech, and they were broadly positive, which is something we haven't seen for a while. And on the back of that, I noticed that Berkeley Homes have started to buy land, so they're starting to look to increase their land banks. So even property developers are seeing that there is a positive spin to this. I think I just think the difficulty is going to be in actually realizing the targets. It's something that we haven't done for so many decades. I just think it's going to be a difficult thing to achieve in the next 4 or 5 years.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you, gents. Just before we move on to the next question, just a polite reminder for everyone. We've had a lot of people completing the polls already, so massive thank you. But if you haven't yet, and you could possibly spare us a few moments, if you could select those and contribute to the polls, it would be really, really helpful. Thank you very much. Okay, so on to the next question. What is the best way to grow the construction workforce? So I think this is a particularly good question. Look forward to the responses.
Well, yeah, this is another issue. When we go through the slides, I think it will become apparent that there are some interesting pickups from this. And one of the things I'd like to refer back to is the output slide at the beginning, when we set the context. But we'll go through this slide anyway. This slide shows total construction employment. The top line, the sort of purple line, is total employment, and then we've got employees, green line, and self-employed, the lighter blue line. And the data shows a marked decline in total employment, most marked from the financial crisis in 2008. So I think that goes back to what we were talking about before. The impact of the financial crisis back in the late 2000s is still having lasting effects on our sector. So there was some recovery evident pre-Brexit and pre-pandemic. But the sector's workforce is around 500,000 lower than its peak in 2008, which is significant. and brings me to another consideration, because if you remember, we go back to the output chart. We're showing output plateauing, but output is actually at virtually the same level as it was pre-pandemic. So the conclusion from that is that we're delivering the same levels of output with a significantly smaller workforce. So there could be productivity improvements that are coming through, and that was the subject of a recent Outlook webinar. I think it was 2 or 3 quarters ago. So it seems from the data that we're delivering levels of output that are actually higher than pre-pandemic levels, with less workers, and you know, the argument probably is that productivity is improving. Maybe there's greater off-site fabrication, but that's certainly something to consider. But going back to the original question, because obviously that productivity issue is slightly off topic. If we assume that demand will pick up with the Labour Party's construction programme, assuming that they don't cancel lots more things, lots more projects in the upcoming budget. If we assume that it will pick up at some point, how can we grow the construction workforce to mitigate any capacity problems in future? So the next slide, please, Rich. I mean, the government's made a fair bit about plans to boost vocational courses, but they're clearly a much longer term solution, which will take time for workers to be ready to be let loose on site. Even a concerted effort to make construction a more attractive career path, which people have been talking about, will take time to embed. And those things, I think, are much longer term solutions. The one thing that stands out for me is that Labour's policy or stated policy of limiting migrant labour does seem fairly short-sighted. In an ideal situation, you'd want to deliver projects from a pool of available local labour, but that isn't possible in the UK, and it hasn't been for some time. Our industry has historically relied on migrant labour to satisfy peaks in demand. You know, if you're going back as far to the great Victorian civil engineering projects, which were built with Irish and Chinese workers, to the post-war reconstruction with labour from the Caribbean, and more recently, we've been reliant on migrant labour from the EU. So one of the sort of issues to tackle this, and I think Keir Starmer was talking to the EU recently, I think their stated aim of improving the UK's relationship with the European bloc could start by allowing free movement for construction labour, so we can go back to having a pool of EU labour, hopefully delivering some of our projects. So that's one way.
I think just before you kind of move on, I guess I would agree with that, David, as well. I think as going back to your chart that shows the decline in sort of workforce, it's not a problem that's just come about. It's been a problem that's been known about for over 2 decades. Yeah. And I recall working on a project for a particular client where they were targeting their program over the next sort of 20, 30 years and trying to work out how best to try and get the supply of labour to meet their demands. And you know, they were spending many millions of pounds. But this is, you know, in the early sort of noughties, so it's a problem that's been around, and it's not one which you would hope to think that some of the stuff that was being put in place then, we'd be getting the benefit of it now. But I think it's one thing is training the workforce, another thing is maintaining them and keeping them in our industry as well. So it's a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the negatives of having a reliance on migrant labour. If you've got a pool of people that you can draw on to satisfy your needs, then training, apprenticeships, and a long-term view become less important, because you can always just dip into this pool of migrant labour. So I do understand the Labour Party's longer-term vision to set up training and apprenticeships, so that long-term demand is satisfied. But in the short term, I do think we need a pool of migrant labour available. If you go on to the next slide, Rich, I think this is much more contentious, and as Carl said, I mean, this has been going on for decades. This availability issue, I mean, I think it's more of a capacity problem, but yeah, it's been going on for as long as I've been in the industry, and that's longer than I care to remember, to be honest. But when I was younger, main contractors actually used to employ site labour, so they then had an incentive to train their workers and set up apprenticeships. But today's tier one contractors, as they're now known, only actually manage the construction process and don't really employ direct trades. They subcontract project delivery to other businesses in the supply chain, and that can be tier two, tier three, and so it goes on. And you know, in my opinion, the fragmentation of the industry makes training a real issue in construction when compared to other sectors. The extensive use of subcontracting and the preponderance of small firms, because if you look at the way the industry's set up, it is mainly small firms with a few large firms managing the process. That really complicates training delivery, and the burden of training tends to fall on the individual rather than the firm and take place on the job. So in my opinion, we need more direct employment in construction. We need to lessen the reliance on self-employment, and that will help with job security, apprenticeships and training. And you know, the ultimate outcome of that is that it will make the sector more attractive to new entrants. So my take is that we need to return to tier one contractors directly employing site labour. And I know, Carl, that you don't think this is a goer really. And I understand, you know, self-employment and you know, having the ability to be agile, and I get all that. But I do think there's room for bigger businesses to directly employ trade labour, and that they can train and provide apprenticeships for.
Yeah, I think without sort of going into too much of a soapbox moment, I think, yeah, my view is it's something which definitely has credibility to do it. I think that's how major projects used to be sort of delivered with the tier one contractors, but I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see that kind of move back to the construction management sort of procurement approach. Is very, very popular with clients, and it's, you know, I think it's difficult, but I completely echo the fact that having the emphasis placed on the industry itself to make provisions to fund and train the individuals and have that career path like you would have in the IT sector and other sectors. It's having that framework in place that makes it more attractive for the sort of trade-based employees. Yeah,
I mean, for me, it's not a government issue. It's an industry issue, and the industry needs to step up. But like I say, if you've always got a reliance on a pool of migrant labour, then the necessity to look longer term is removed. And the other issue for me is that construction projects really, and the clients bear some responsibility for this. They normally go to the lowest bidder, and you know, you end up with all sorts of issues based on that. But that's probably the subject of another webinar. And finally on the workforce issue, and we touched a bit on when I started talking about productivity. Currently, labour shortages are less of an immediate problem, given that we're predicting that demand's going to be fairly stagnant until next year. And that's one great thing about our sector. It has an innate way of reaching equilibrium. So supply and demand always seem to be just about in balance. But having said that, if we look at Labour's proposals, there could be an uptick in demand, depending on the outcome of the budget, and the supply position will then tighten. So unless action is taken fairly swiftly to boost our long-term training and apprenticeships provision. The construction's definitely got an image problem. There's no doubt about that, particularly for young people. So we need to make it more attractive to work in. And for me, that means more direct employment, defined career paths, and less reliance on subcontracting. But in the short run, I do think we're going to continue to have to rely on migrant labour, just to meet demand in the short term. Okay, that was rather a lot on on workforce there.
And, yeah, I mean, all we needed was yes or no there, really. But thanks. Great. Not to sound too much like headmaster at the moment, but we're running a little bit behind at the moment, gents. So if we could try and keep this one a little bit more punchy if possible, that would be brilliant. Okay. So yeah, consider yourself scolded. We'll. But next question. So should the new government take a different approach to managing major projects?
That's me again, I think. Yeah. The short answer is yes, given that we're under time constraints.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right.
I mean, you've only got to look at it's the series of project delays and cost overruns on major public projects over the last few decades, to be honest. So absolutely, yeah. And I think the establishment of the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, NISTA, will make a difference to setting strategic priorities, to oversee the design, scope, and costing and delivery of projects, which is encouraging, I think, because anything that can improve the public client's capacity, capability, and accountability in major project delivery would be a really positive move, I think, in attempting to ensure the best value for public funds. And this is something that Rachel Reeves was majoring on the other day. So absolutely think it's a good plan. Let's see how it works in reality. Short but sweet on that one.
Excellent, much appreciated.
And I think it's over to me on this one.
It is.
I think, in my opinion, I agree. Yes is the answer to it does need to take a slightly different approach, because as the data suggests, we have had major overruns and cost overruns and delays, etc. And the perception of major infrastructure projects and large programs is not great from a public purse perspective. So yeah, I agree. The answer is yes. I guess how does the government deliver value for money? So we extend that question a little bit. So first and foremost, the government needs a clear strategy. I think they're making noise about it, and they're certainly definitely sort of pointing in the right direction from the stuff that's been stated so far. But the strategy needs to embrace the expertise that exists within the industry. They need to look upon the great skills and experience that we have. If they intend to try and deliver value for money across these large-scale build programs that have been talked about, I emphasize talked about for the hospitals and the sort of prisons. The NISTA, as it's going to be called, needs to take the lead and steer clear guidance around the themes such as effective planning and design, and that will include the kind of planning and proposed planning reform at the centre of that. So that's making sure that they're conducting detailed feasibility studies to ensure that the projects are viable, and that all the potential risks and benefits are widely understood and communicated. Sustainable design, that's at the heart of the BCIS in terms of what we do. It's incorporating sustainable and energy efficient designs. They need to consider reducing the long-term operational costs and that environmental impact. Again, we're wax lyrical about this from a BCIS perspective, but the government needs to embrace this as well. And ultimately kind of cost control and bringing innovation in. So stringent benchmarking of key project components, using reliable data to ensure that we are achieving best value, but not compromising on quality on that. And wherever possible, I guess, start to use innovative materials that are not only cost effective, but can also be or are also sustainable. The government talk about expanding the capacity of the UK prison estate. Well, James Timpson, in his new role, needs to implement a strategy that adopts the above principles if he is to deliver prisons that are safe, secure, and ultimately kind of built to last. So that's kind of what we wanted to cover on that, just making sure those principles are covered.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely perfect. I think we're back on track now. So feel free to filibuster in the next round. I think this is an absolutely outstanding question. I'm really interested to see this, and the polls are coming through as well. So let's see if everyone agrees or if we're at opposite ends by the end of this. But which will impact construction more, the new government or the Bank of England?
Well, in my view, in the short term, the Bank of England will, and the announcement is going to be shortly after this webinar. In fact, I'm assuming that interest rates might actually fall by 0.25%, but we'll see. The Labour Party desire to attract private investment to support construction is crucial. It's something that's been lacking over the last few years because of the challenging conditions and instability that we've all felt. And I do think that the Labour Party have taken steps to try and address the stability issue anyway. I think the economic conditions were much more of a challenge for them. The new government says that it can give investors the certainty they need, which I think they've started to do. The National Wealth Fund being set up with a target of attracting £3 of private investment for every £1 of public investment. We'll see how that gets on. The issue for me is that private investment relies on a thriving wider economy, a favourable corporate tax regime, and borrowing costs that aren't prohibitive. And looking at our current state, none of these conditions currently exist in the UK. So while Labour may want to attract private investors, to me it seems unlikely that they'll be able to realise the return on investment needed. They'll be looking at the UK in comparison with lots of other countries. So I think the one thing we do need fairly quickly is borrowing costs to come down and sustainable growth to return to the wider economy. And those sort of conditions will start to attract private investment. So short term, the Bank of England. got my vote.
Put your bets on now, Will. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So next question is the new government pro net zero? So I'm actually going to cover this, so we can give you both a quick breather before we get on. But the new government has reaffirmed its commitment to net zero, reversing previous government rollbacks, as we know. The key initiatives we've seen so far is the clean energy superpower by 2030. So that's the restated goal to position Britain as a leader in clean energy. The National Wealth Fund, launched to drive green investment and infrastructure. The Great British Energy, which, as we've probably all seen, is a publicly owned company focusing on renewable energy investment. 7.3 billion investment allocated to future industries, so things like hydrogen and steel. Warm Homes Programme, aimed at upgrading UK homes to improve energy efficiency and reduce bills. And then finally is the growth and skills levy. So this was essentially replacing the previous apprenticeship levy, allowing firms to train staff in green skills. But big questions remain over the feasibility of the net zero targets, and really how the government will actually achieve them. Construction industry is already in the grip of a skill shortage, especially in M&E and green collar skills. The 6.6 billion Labour has promised through the Warm Homes programme amounts to just £1,320 when divided among the 5 million homes. So, this is really woefully inadequate when compared to the estimated £26,000 cost, according to the Climate Change Committee. So the dearth of skills in retrofitting has also been highlighted by many, including the Chartered Institute of Buildings, the CIOB, who has called on for the government to invest in a pipeline of green collar workers. And crucially, from our perspective, as yet, there's been no announcement from the government that will mandate the reporting of embodied carbon. So this week, the industry figures have made a fresh plea to try and amend the building regulations 2010 with a new Part Z that would enshrine its reporting in legislation. So, quite frustrated we've not seen any move in this yet. And as with many aspects of the government plans, there's an element of wait and see what happens, in my view.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that as well.
Yeah, hopefully. Be interested if we get any opposing thoughts on the comments, but be interested to see. So, from this now, we're nearly at time here, everyone. So thank you for staying with us. So just a bit of a summary. Apologies, double click there. So just returning to the questions, can the government build 1.5 million homes in 5 years? Our conclusion here is it is unlikely without a big increase in social housing provision for local authorities. I think is probably a fair assessment. What's the best way to grow the construction workforce? So what David discussed here was short-term migration, longer-term increased training and apprenticeships with tier 1 contractors employing more site labour. Next, should the government take a different approach to managing major projects? Again, our view is yes. Improving the capability, capacity and accountability of the public client should help. Establishment of NISTA, likely to be a positive move. Government as well, the other clients would benefit from better data management and benchmarking. So next, which will impact the construction more, the new government or the Bank of England? So probably the Bank of England in the short term, and much anticipated decrease to the cost of borrowing. And I think from so far what we've seen in the polls, I think everyone seems to be well aligned on this point. But then finally, is the new government pro net zero? So our assumption is yes, but it won't be easy to meet the pledges that they've made, and they need to include embodied carbon in their thinking going forward. So that is all the pre-prepared questions. We have had an incredible amount of questions through, so thank you all for sending them through. What we're going to try and do is we are technically over time. I think if we try and squeeze in a couple just before we finish for 12, gents, I'm going to try and go as lightly as you can, as I imagine they're not simple questions. We
pick the easiest ones. Pick the easiest ones.
I'm trying here, but none of them are particularly straightforward. I'm going to go through. Yeah, okay, great. We're going to start from this one. So from Jordan Green, given the current challenges with planning submission turnarounds, unless Labour announces major reforms to the process, do we think anything will actually improve in terms of output?
No. That was easy. That was easy. I mean, the big problem is going to be capacity in local authority planning departments. I mean, Labour have said they're going to employ 300 additional planners. I would imagine that will be a drop in the ocean. And the other issue is it's not just about planners; it's about the other construction professional services. So architects, engineers, quantity surveyors, building surveyors. That whole capacity within local authorities has been completely diminished over the last 2 or 3 decades. So I think it's going to remain a blocker.
It's not just about, they talk about bringing the new planners in and recruiting them. It's training them, it's recruiting, but it's also retaining them. because once they've had the skills, it's almost how do you keep those within the public sector and not see them disappear into the private sector?
Yeah,
that's the big challenge.
So the other thing is I think the planning issue is a bit of tinkering around the edges. I mean, I do think there are some planning blockages, most of it caused by lack of capacity. But the other stuff about building on the grey belt, and I've heard it all before, frankly.
Yeah.
So yeah, we shall see. Great. We've had a lot of questions along the same theme, so thank you for all who have contributed on here. I'm going to try and summarize them all, but very much around the retrofit existing stock discussion. So I know we've had it internally for at least 12 months now. So I think this is probably, this question summarizes everyone else's thoughts who have contributed. So as birth rates are down and boomer population bulge is likely to pass soon, with older properties coming into the market, do you think that the government should focus their commitment to retrofitting existing stock, which could be more beneficial and realistic than policies to build more new homes?
Well, this is going to be controversial, but I think we should adopt the European approach, which is to knock down and rebuild, because retrofitting, frankly, is just not going to happen. I mean, if you look at most other, and I include the US in this, if you look at their construction data, construction output data, much more of it is new build than repair and renovation. So they do have a tendency to knock things down and rebuild. Us, on the other hand, in the UK, are much more romantically linked to buildings that were put up 150 years ago for reasons that I just cannot understand, because they're inefficient in so many ways. And you know, the flip side to that would be you get a massive boost in demand, which our sector obviously needs. I knew that would be controversial, and I don't expect anyone to agree with me, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I'm not going to go into it. No, I was going to say, I think there's a balance. I think there's a balance. Say again?
I said you both live in new builds, don't you?
Yeah. But my point on Dave, I think there's a balance. I think it's about going back to the points that said about major projects and major programs. It's about doing that kind of detailed feasibility. Is it viable to do a retrofit over a new build? And it's making sure that the expertise is there and that the future sight on the building needs. And I think there are absolute examples where you can retrofit, particularly to service the need of housing. There are old government buildings that can be converted into very, very satisfactory, affordable housing, which would meet current sort of standards, as opposed to knocking down and rebuilding from site. I think there are cases where you can do that, but it's about saying you don't need to necessarily go one way or the other. It's about finding that balance.
Excellent.
I sound like a politician.
Yeah. Politically correct.
So this is quite an interesting one, actually. A little bit off the wall, so I am going to ask it. So the question is this may sound like a silly question, but do we need 1.5 million new homes in the next 5 years? Should it be less or more?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, people are constantly saying that there's, a massive shortage of homes, but has anyone actually done the maths to work out what we need? I think it is a really good question, and the fact that the market can sustainably deliver about 217,000 a year suggests that that's what the market will demand, and I struggle to see how that's going to change. So there's a big step change between 220 and 370. It's 150,000 additional homes to be built a year. I'm not sure that there is a need. And the other thing is that if you own a home, if you're in that lucky position, flooding the market with you know, lots of supply is actually going to have an impact on price levels. So I've obviously got a vested interest, not to hit that target.
Great, thank you, David, and thank you to Fernando for submitting the question. A brilliant question, couldn't miss that one. So let me just see. I think if we've got any others that stick out. Okay, so the next one is from Rory Cooper. So, with challenges with working outdoors and construction being a difficult environment, long hours and poor pay, how would you envisage the construction industry being more attractive to younger persons, certainly more trade style roles?
I think for me, if I jump in first, I think the way in which certain processes are now evolving. So use of, I guess, drones and gadgets, so to speak, are the sort of things that perhaps would become more of interest to the younger generation as they come in. It's, you know, walking around site with a drone, taking surveys, etc. Are the sort of things, the innovations, which I think would make it more attractive to a sector of our population that probably wouldn't have necessarily come into this sector. So I think things like that, innovation, and I think there's also a little bit of a play on the sustainability angle as well, because I think more and more of the new generation coming through are more aware of the environment and the need to protect the environment. And I think there's a lot more of a campaign of perhaps doing some of the new techniques of construction to embrace the kind of sustainable construction. So I think there's two levers there. One is around the sort of innovative kind of technology, and the other is around the sustainable approach.
I think for me, we need to make more of the fact that the sector is a creative sector. So the output is, you know, created from scratch, from a group of materials and labour coming together to build a piece of infrastructure, to put a building together. And, you know, there's some real creative satisfaction in that that we probably don't make enough of. And the other thing comes down to money. When you're young, going into construction at a trade level, the money's good. But as you age, you know, you get more responsibilities, you maybe have a family, your money doesn't really increase that much. So we need to set up proper career paths for trades to make it more attractive. And, you know, you've only got to see at the moment that a lot of people are retiring. So the age distribution is skewed towards older workers in construction, and they're starting to drop out of the sector. And I'm sure one of the reasons for that is they can probably earn more money working for Uber. So.
Great, that'll be officially on the BCIS website tomorrow. Thanks, David. Great. I think we're pretty much run out of time now, so it feels like a natural time to wrap up. So just a few bits, just wanted to clarify, everyone who sent us a question, just our commitment, we will ensure that we answer these and you'll get these responses in writing when we share out the recording and the rest of the details from the day. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for David and Carl for all of your help for today. Hopefully you found today's session great. I think we've covered a lot of ground and hopefully covered some interesting questions. And I think that will be just a final, obviously a quick push from ourselves. If you could follow us on LinkedIn, you can either scan the QR code or search for BCIS. But that is everything from us today. So thank you, gentlemen, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks. Bye for now.